In a dusty Texas fairground, a wealthy landowner mocked a skinny farm boy with a cruel dare. "Touch this wild stallion and I'll give you my ranch." The crowd roared with laughter, certain the black beast would kill him. But when the boy stepped inside the pen, what happened next stunned everyone. Because sometimes the wildest hearts choose the gentlest hands. The county fairground in Amarillo burned gold beneath a late summer sun, heat rippling over the tin roofs, and the bleachers painted a hopeful, flaking blue. Smoke from mesquite grills threaded the air with something sweet and charred, while a fiddler on the hay wagon stage sawed a tune that made boots tap, even when their owners swore they were too tired to dance. Barrel racers had kicked up the dust earlier, leaving the arena rimmed with hoofprints like commas, a sentence half finished and waiting for its last bold word. Charles Whitmore liked to be that word. He stood at the rail in a pearl snap shirt, white as a dare, a gold-buckled belt announcing his victories the way a general wears medals. Folks said his land ran so far west, a Sunday ride became a Monday return, and that if you followed his fences long enough, you'd end up believing in infinity. He wore the swagger of a man whose name opened gates, and he held a paper cup full of whiskey, like it was a gavel that could decide what was and wasn't true. "Bring him out," he called, not loudly, but the way a wind can move a wheat field. Gate boys jogged, chains clinked, and from the holding pen a black stallion erupted into afternoon like a storm dropped out of a clear sky. The horse hit the dirt and pivoted, muscles cleaving the light, his neck arched and eyes burning a kind of warning that old hands in the crowd felt in their ribs. He was called Ranger, though no one claimed to have named him. The gossip said the horse had dragged 3 seasoned cowboys into the dust and sent one to the clinic with a shoulder that would never again trust a lariat. Ranger didn't just snort. He pronounced the air unworthy and flung it from his nostrils. He pinned ears, feinted, skated sideways with the quickness of a shadow, deciding where to disappear next. When he slammed a forehoof down, you could feel it through plank and boot and bone. People leaned forward the way you do at the edge of water that might be deeper than you think. Charles smiled like a man admiring his own reflection. "Meanest horse in the panhandle," he told the men clustered near him. Bankers, seed reps, a city councilman with a sunburn and a loosened tie. "Not for sale. Not for show. Just a little reminder that not every wild thing boos." He took a sip, savoring his words. "Cost me a fortune. Worth every penny." At the far end of the rail, a boy had stopped to look. Thin as a fence picket and sun-browned, he wore a hand-me-down denim shirt with the elbows whited from scrubbing. His hat was the kind you rescue from a pawn shop rack and promise to treat, better than the last man did. He set a sack of feed at his feet and watched the horse, a quiet that didn't belong to fear settling over his shoulders, like a coat that fit. Someone recognized him. "That's Martha Turner's grandson," a woman murmured, balancing a lemonade cup. "Eli. Runs errands, mucks stalls over at Westgate." Good kid Charles caught the boy's stillness out of the corner of his eye the way a hawk notices a mouse that isn't running. He turned, let the sun polish his grin. The crowd, already half-tuned to his frequency, answered with that eager silence towns get when they smell a story about to be told. "You," Charles said, pointing with the rim of his cup. "You've got steady eyes for a kid." "Like what you see?" Eli didn't answer right away. Ranger had shifted, testing the chain on the lead, And Eli tipped his head a little, as if he were listening to something under the noise. Beneath the fiddles, beneath the shouts of boys at the ring toss, beneath the sizzle of onions on the griddle. A horse breathes loud when he's angry. He breathes different when he's hurting. "I see a proud animal," the boy said finally, voice clear and plain, the panhandle in it. "I see he don't like being stared at." Laughter slid across the bleachers, a chuckle from men who'd forgotten their first days and the courage it took to speak among them. Charles spread his free hand, magnanimous. "A philosopher. We've got ourselves a philosopher." He turned, letting the crowd enjoy him. "Tell you what, philosopher, touch that horse and I'll give you my whole ranch." The joke went off like a firecracker. A few women clapped without smiling. Somebody whooped. A boy repeated, breathless, "His whole ranch," even as his father shushed him. Eli's mouth didn't change. The wind lifted grit against his ankles and carried the smell of cotton candy past him, spun sugar and summer together, and somewhere in that sweetness, he could almost hear his grandmother's breath whistling the way it did when she'd had to climb too many porch steps with the laundry. "Charles," said a voice near his elbow. Margaret Whitmore, tall and steady, eyes the blue of winter shade, had come up without a fuss. "Enough." She laid a hand on his sleeve. "You don't need to prove anything." "You hear that?" Charles announced, as if she'd stepped to a microphone. "My better half thinks I've got nothing left to prove." "That true, folks?" A ripple of amiable denial moved through the bleachers. It's hard to disagree with a man feeding you entertainment for free. He winked at Margaret like she'd just made his punchline land. The sheriff, Coleman, had materialized with the unhurried gait of men who can arrive anywhere precisely when they mean to. He looked over the scene with a face that kept its opinions like a ledger, useful, private. "Y'all keep this to talking," he said mildly. "It's a fair day. Let's not turn it into paperwork." "Nothing but talk," Charles promised, but the whiskey in his grip trembled the way sunlight does on a stock tank when something moves under the surface. "Just sport, the boy's free to decline," Eli tipped his hat to the sheriff. "I've got to get this feed over to the Smiths," he said, nudging the sack with the worn toe of his boot. "And my grandma's waiting on me." You scared?" a young man in a crisp hat called, not unkindly, just in the manner of those who measure themselves with the rulers closest at hand. "It's okay to be." Eli looked at Ranger again. The stallion had gone still, neck long, nostrils flaring, a statue that remembered it had once been lightning. In that pause, the boy felt a familiar ache, the one that visited when he came home late and found his grandmother asleep in her chair with a bowl of beans cooling on the table and the radio whispering a hymn about rivers and rest. The ache said time was thin and chances thinner. The ache said dignity was a thing you had to feed, same as a horse. He shifted the feed sack onto his shoulder and crossed the dirt toward the gate. People swiveled to make a path. Laughter folded into a hush with heartbeat speed. The fiddler, sensing the drama, let his bow hang, and the tune fell off a cliff, leaving only wind and the ticking of the cooling bleachers. "Eli," Margaret said gently, her voice just for him. "You don't owe this crowd a thing." He paused. The sun had moved a notch higher, searing the top of his hat, and sweat traced a line behind his ear, as if it were trying to write down what he was feeling before he forgot. "No, ma'am," he said. "I don't." He eased the feed sack to the rail, patted it once, like a promise he meant to keep later. "But that horse don't owe us nothing either. He don't deserve to be dared at." Charles's smile thinned. "All this poetry," he said, a blade hidden in the amusement. "We'll get a book out of you yet." So what's it going to be? Talk or touch? Sheriff Coleman stood where the gate chain joined the post, thumb hooked in his belt, eyes on both male creatures whose pride had brought them to the same patch of dust. One with a cup, one with a heartbeat steadying itself because it had to. "If you're fixing to make a wager, Charles," the sheriff said, "you might want to mind your words." "Names have weight in this county. Everybody's a lawyer," Charles said, tossing the last sip of whiskey into his mouth like courage could be swallowed. "Fine. It ain't a wager. It's charity. Entertainment for an honest day's crowd." A hot wind shouldered in from the west and flipped a paper plate, skittering it in a circle until it lay flat, as if the land itself had smoothed it with a palm. Ranger's skin twitched under the touch of the air. He snapped his head and planted his feet. And the crowd felt that thunder again, the kind that doesn't need a cloud. Eli stepped up to the gate. His hands, when he set them on the top board, were nicked and browned and careful. He didn't look at Charles or Margaret or the sheriff or the men waiting to see a boy become a story they could retell for years. He looked at the animal whose body said no, with every coiled line, but whose eyes, if you were close enough, also said maybe. "Don't," Margaret whispered, a prayer carried on one breath. "Let the boy try," someone else murmured, not unkindly, as if failure might be a lesson worth witnessing. Eli unlatched the gate. The metal rang like a small bell. He slid through, leaving it open behind him because closing something is a kind of promise, and he wasn't ready to make any he couldn't keep. The heat inside the pen hit him different. It had breath in it, a taste of copper and dust, and the clean, grassy mint of a horse that hasn't been asked a question it wants to answer in a long time. Ranger snaked his neck, tested the length of the line, and went sideways with that dancer's contempt he owned. The boy stopped where he was, boot soles riding the dirt, shoulders loose. You could tell by the way he stood that he knew if a thing is going to move toward you, you don't chase it. Charles leaned both elbows on the rail, hungry for spectacle. "Well," he called, "we gonna end this day with a fairy tale or a funeral?" The sheriff shot him a look that said a lot without using a single word from the penal code. Margaret closed her eyes for the briefest second, the sigh she didn't let out making her collar flutter. From somewhere near the cotton candy tent, a child cried and was comforted, proof that the world had not stopped turning just because the arena had. Eli drew a breath that filled his ribs, and with it the scent of the fair found him. The sugar, the smoke, the leather warmed by sun, the horse's salt. You could watch the air steady him. He tipped his hat back a fraction, and in a voice not much louder than a prayer, spoke the first words he would ever say to the animal that would unmake and remake his life. "Hey there, Ranger." The stallion's ears flicked, that tiny mercy of attention. Eli let silence do the rest, because in the panhandle, you learn early that talk is what you do when you can't stand the honesty of quiet. The boy didn't move. The horse didn't lunge. The sun burned, and the whole town leaned forward to see what would happen to a promise tossed into the dust like a coin in a wishing well. "Go on then," Charles murmured, his grin sharpened by the waiting. "Touch him." The air inside the pen seemed heavier than the air outside, thick with heat and the dust Ranger had stirred into a haze. Eli felt it settle on his skin, in his lungs, as he stepped farther into the circle of dirt. The feed sack sat abandoned by the gate, and all that separated him from disaster was the width of a breath and the steadiness of his heart. Ranger, stood across from him, black as a thunderhead, his body coiled tight as if lightning waited under the hide. The stallion's neck arched, ears flattened, nostrils wide and wet. He scraped one hoof against the ground, sending a sound like flint against stone through the silence. People pressed against the railings, their voices hushed now, stripped of laughter. The whole fairground leaned forward to witness either a miracle or a mauling. Eli kept his boots planted in the dirt. He remembered his grandmother's words, that gentleness was stronger than force, that sometimes the world needed a whisper instead of a shout. His mouth was dry, but he let his voice out soft, barely carrying across the few feet of dust between them. "Easy, Ranger," he said. The stallion's head jerked, eyes flashing. He snorted and spun sideways, muscles rippling like a storm wave. The crowd gasped. Eli didn't move. His stillness was its own kind of defiance, a refusal to feed the animal's panic with fear. For a long moment, nothing happened except the sound of breathing. Eli's steady, Ranger's ragged. Then the boy lifted his hand, palm open, not reaching, only waiting. Dust clung to the sweat on his brow, but his gaze never wavered. Ranger lowered his head an inch, ears flicking forward, then back again. The rope at his halter sagged, the handler on the fence frozen, afraid to breathe lest it break the fragile balance. And then, in a movement so small most missed it, the stallion took a single step closer. The silence deepened. Eli's hand stayed where it was, fingers trembling only slightly. His heart hammered, but he forced his breath to slow, to match the rhythm of the horse's chest. He thought of the evenings sitting by his grandmother's porch, listening to the wind through cottonwoods, and let that calm carry through his arm to his outstretched palm. Another step. Ranger's muzzle hovered inches from his skin, hot breath rolling over the boy's hand like the desert wind before rain. The horse's eyes were wild, yet searching, as though he were weighing the boy's spirit against the ghosts of men who had tried to conquer him. Then, impossibly, Ranger closed the distance. His nose touched Eli's palm. The world seemed to stop. The fiddler on the wagon stage held his bow mid-air. Vendors paused with spatulas over frying onions. Children clutched their father's arms. Charles Whitmore's grin froze on his face, disbelief hardening into something sharper. Even Sheriff Coleman straightened, his hand unconsciously brushing the badge on his chest, as though to remind himself the law was real in a moment that felt like legend. Eli's eyes burned, not from fear but from the weight of it, the sudden fragile connection that felt older than words. He stroked the stallion's muzzle once, slow, like tracing the grain of polished wood. Ranger shivered, but didn't pull away. A murmur rippled through the crowd, building into scattered cheers, then louder, until the bleachers shook with astonished voices. But inside the pen, Eli didn't hear them. The world had narrowed to the warmth beneath his hand, the rise and fall of the stallion's breath, the quiet knowledge that, for this heartbeat, trust had been given. Charles slammed his cup down on the rail, whiskey splattering in the dust. "Enough," he barked, though his voice cracked against the tide of the crowd's awe. "It's a trick." The boy won't last a minute near him, but the sheriff raised a hand, silencing him. "I saw it," Coleman said. His voice was even, carrying across the arena. "We all did." The horse let him touch. The crowd roared again, their disbelief turning into exhilaration, but Eli barely noticed. He lowered his hand, stepped back slowly, and the stallion lifted his head, ears twitching, not hostile, not resigned, just watching him. For the first time since being brought to Whitmore's ranch, Ranger stood without thrashing at his ropes. The beast and the boy regarded each other, two creatures cut from the same stubborn cloth, both too wild for chains but willing, just for a moment, to meet in peace. Eli turned and walked toward the gate. His legs trembled under him, but he didn't stumble. At the fence, he glanced back once. Ranger stamped a hoof, tossing his mane, as though marking the boy in memory. The gate clanged shut behind him. The fairground erupted, voices tumbling over one another, telling the story already, shaping it into legend. Charles's face had gone pale, fury simmering under the surface. Margaret Whitmore's hand pressed to her lips, eyes shining with something like awe. And Clara, half hidden in the shadow of the bleachers, stared at the boy with a spark of recognition, as if she understood that nothing in their lives would be the same after today. Eli picked up the feed sack, slung it back over his shoulder, and walked toward the waiting crowd. Dust clung to him, sweat streaked his face, but in his chest burned a fire steadier than fear. He had touched the untouchable. And though he did not yet know it, that single gesture had bound him to a destiny far larger than himself. The dust had barely settled when Charles Whitmore pushed through the crowd, his boots grinding hard against the dirt, as though he meant to crush the astonishment out of it. The sheriff still stood with his hand resting near his badge, the crowd buzzing like bees in a shaken hive. But Charles's voice rose above them all, sharp as a whip. "Don't think this means a damn thing," he shouted, his face red with the effort of holding on to his pride. "Touching a horse isn't taming it." Any fool can stand still long enough for curiosity to do the work. His eyes cut toward Eli, who stood beside the rail with the feed sack slung over his shoulder, sweat still dripping into the collar of his shirt. The boy said nothing. He didn't need to. The crowd had already decided what they saw, and it wasn't luck. Mothers pulled their children closer, whispering about courage. Men shook their heads, half admiring, half bewildered. And somewhere near the edge of the bleachers, Clara Whitmore's heart hammered in her chest. She had never seen Ranger bow to anyone. Not to her father's men, not to her father himself. Only to the boy with nothing but steady eyes and a quiet voice. Charles raised his cup again, though this time his hand trembled. If the boy thinks he's some kind of horse whisperer, then let's put it to the test. 30 days. He rides Ranger in front of the whole county, or he's proven nothing but a circus trick. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sheriff frowned. "Charles, that's no small challenge for a grown man, let alone a boy." "You can't." "I can and I will," Charles cut in, his words loud and hot. He turned in a slow circle, making sure every witness heard. 30 days. If he succeeds, he gets my word and my land. If he fails, he and that sickly grandmother of his pack up and leave Amarillo. No more charity, no more pity. The Turners vanish. A hush slammed over the arena, heavy and stunned. The words carried the sting of cruelty, sharper even than the wager. For years the townsfolk had watched Eli and his grandmother scrape by, his small wages from odd jobs barely keeping food on the table. To exile them was a sentence. Yet, in the twisted pride of Charles Whitmore, it was spoken like a game. Sheriff Coleman lifted a hand, his voice steady but low. "That's a hard bargain, Charles. You'd put a child and a woman out on the road just to feed your pride?" Charles sneered. "This isn't about pride. It's about proof. If the boy wants to play a man's game, let him shoulder a man's stakes." Eli looked up at the sheriff, then back at the horse still standing in the pen. Ranger pawed the dirt, his black coat shining under the sun, his breath steaming in the warm air. The boy swallowed hard. He thought of his grandmother waiting in her rocker on the porch, her lungs wheezing with each shallow breath, the sound that told him every day was borrowed. He thought of the feed sack on his shoulder, the odd jobs that never stretched far enough, the worry lines deepening on Martha Turner's face. "I'll do it," he said. His voice cracked only once, but it carried. 30 days. I'll ride him. A murmur swelled into a roar, half disbelief, half exhilaration. The sheriff's mouth pressed into a line, but he nodded, knowing there was no undoing it now. The people had heard, and in Texas, a man's words, even when poisoned, became law when the whole town bore witness. Charles's grin spread wide, cruel as the desert sun. Then it's settled. 30 days from today, at the Amarillo Fair. Bring your horse, boy. Bring your courage, too. What little you've got left. He turned and stalked away, Margaret at his side, her face tight with something like shame. Clara stayed where she was, her knuckles white against the railing. She couldn't look away from the boy who had just staked his future on a wager no sane man would take. The crowd spilled out of the bleachers, voices churning with gossip, wagers already being made. Some predicted the boy wouldn't last a week. Others whispered about miracles, about how maybe God himself had sent a hand to touch the wild beast. The dust rose in swirls, clinging to boots and hats, carrying the story beyond the fairground before the sun even began to dip. Eli shouldered his sack again, his chest tight, his heart thudding like a hammer against thin wood. He walked toward the road leading out of town, past the vendors closing their stands, past men shaking their heads, past women whose eyes softened when they saw him. Every step felt heavier, as if he carried the weight of the whole county on his back. When he reached the edge of the fairground, Sheriff Coleman caught up with him. "Son," the sheriff said quietly, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder, "you don't have to do this. That man plays games with lives, and he set you a trap you may not crawl out of." Eli met his gaze, steady. "If I don't, my grandma loses the only home she's ever known. If I try and fail, at least I tried. But if I walk away, she loses anyway." The sheriff's throat worked. He looked away, then back. "You've got grit, I'll give you that. Just be careful. Courage is one thing. Stubbornness is another. Don't let him break you." Eli nodded. "I won't." As the boy walked on, the sun flared orange over the panhandle, painting long shadows across the dirt road. Behind him, the fairground echoed with fading voices, laughter mingling with whispers of doubt. Ahead of him lay 30 days of dust, sweat, and a storm on 4 hooves waiting to test every ounce of his spirit. And though Eli's chest tightened with fear, somewhere deep inside him a flicker of hope glowed brighter than the dusk. The wager was cruel, the path impossible, but the bond he had felt in that single touch told him one truth louder than all the noise behind him. Ranger had listened. And if the stallion had listened once, maybe, just maybe, he would listen again. The Turner cabin sat on the edge of the Panhandle Flats, a sagging porch and a rusting tin roof that rattled whenever the wind shoved against it. Eli trudged home from the fairground with the weight of 30 days pressing on his back, heavier than the feed sack he carried. He set it down by the steps and pushed open the door. The smell of boiled beans and wood smoke wrapping around him like an old blanket. Inside, Martha Turner rocked slowly in her chair, her chest rising and falling with the shallow rhythm of a body that had fought too many winters. She looked up, her eyes sharp despite the wear of illness. "What have you done, boy?" Eli knelt by her side, taking her thin hands into his. The skin was paper dry, veins blue beneath it. "I had no choice, Grandma. He dared me before the whole town. If I win, we keep the land. If I fail—" He hesitated, but she finished it for him. "If you fail, we're driven out." Her sigh was long, not angry, but tired. "You carry too much on those narrow shoulders, Eli. But I see the fire in you, same as your father had. If you believe this is what you must do, then you do it. Just don't forget that courage feeds better on patience than pride." The next morning before dawn, Eli was already at the Whitmore Ranch, a rope borrowed from the sheriff and a battered bucket of oats borrowed from Mr. Jenkins at the livery. The sun rose slow and heavy, painting the sky in streaks of peach and scarlet, as though the land itself expected blood to be spilled. Ranger stood in the corral, black hide glistening with dew, nostrils flaring at the smell of another day's battle. The first attempt was chaos. Eli climbed the fence and slid inside, moving slow, whispering the way he had the day before. But Ranger wasn't curious now. He was angry. The stallion lunged, teeth bared, and Eli barely scrambled back to the rail in time. Dust exploded where hooves struck, the sound like gunfire. Laughter from hired cowboys stung his ears, but Eli kept his jaw tight. Day after day, the routine repeated. Eli rose with the dawn, trudged the mile to the corral, and faced the storm on 4 legs. He brought oats, water, and his stubborn silence. Sometimes he read aloud from the Bible his grandmother kept on the table. Not for piety, but for rhythm, his voice steady in the face of snorts and stamping hooves. Ranger never came close those first days, only circled, restless, ears pinned back. Eli's body carried bruises the way trees carried knots, each one a mark of survival. By the 5th day, Clara Whitmore appeared. She lingered at the edge of the barn, her braid loose over her shoulder, a notebook tucked under her arm. When Ranger pinned his ears and charged, she gasped, but Eli didn't flinch. He held his ground until the horse veered off, then leaned against the rail, breath heaving. "You're crazy," Clara whispered when he finally climbed out. "Maybe," Eli said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But crazy's all I've got left." She studied him for a long moment before slipping something from her notebook pocket. A small harmonica, dented and old. "Music calms them. My granddad used to play to his horses when they spooked. Try it." That night, Eli sat on the porch, the harmonica cold in his hands. He blew a shaky tune, uneven, cracked, but the notes floated over the fields like smoke. His grandmother smiled faintly from her chair. "Your father played the same," she murmured. "Sounded like hope, even when we had none." On the 10th day, Eli carried the harmonica into the corral. Ranger paced, tail lashing, ears pinned. Eli sat cross-legged in the dust, closed his eyes, and played. The tune wavered, caught, then steadied. At first Ranger snorted, pawing the earth in irritation. But slowly, his ears flicked forward. His steps slowed. The terrible storm in his eyes dimmed to a wary curiosity. For the first time since the wager began, Ranger did not lunge. He stood still, listening. The hired cowboys muttered among themselves. One spat into the dirt. "He's got the devil on a leash with a child's toy." Another shook his head, unease written in his face. They'd seen whips and ropes, chains and spurs, but never a boy with nothing but patience and a song. That evening, Eli stayed longer, watching Ranger, until the stars bruised the sky. The stallion lowered his head once, pawed the ground, and for a fleeting moment seemed to bow. Eli's chest tightened. He knew it wasn't surrender, not yet, but it was something, an opening in the wall of fury. The days rolled on, blistering with heat. Eli's shirt clung to him with sweat, his hands raw from rope and splintered wood. The world smelled of manure, leather, and dust that never quite left his tongue. His grandmother coughed harder each night, and the sound drove him back to the corral each morning with fiercer resolve. He talked to Ranger as if the horse understood, about the cracked porch boards, about the fear of losing their land, about the loneliness of a boy with too many burdens. By the 15th day, when Eli approached with the bucket of oats, Ranger did not rear. He did not charge. He simply stood, chest heaving, ears twitching, as though listening for the sound of the harmonica. Eli exhaled, his hands trembling as he set the bucket down. For the first time, the stallion lowered his head and took a cautious step forward. Dust rose soft around his hooves, carrying the scent of something more than fury. Hope. And for the first time in weeks, Eli allowed himself to believe that 30 days might be enough. The days on the Turner farm bled into each other, a rhythm of dawn and dust, of Eli rising with the first light to meet the black stallion that waited like a storm behind the rails. By now the whole town had begun to whisper. Some said the boy was touched by madness, others by God. Yet every morning, without fail, Eli walked the mile to Whitmore's ranch, set down his bucket of oats, and faced Ranger with nothing but patience in his hands. Clara Whitmore had watched from shadows at first. She stood with her back pressed to the barn wall, her breath held tight, as though afraid it would carry to her father's ears. From her hiding place, she saw things no one else bothered to see. The way Eli's voice softened when he spoke to the horse, the way Ranger's ears twitched at the sound of the harmonica, the way boy and beast mirrored each other in stubbornness. What had begun as curiosity grew into something else, something she kept pressed like a secret note inside her chest. One evening, Clara crept to the corral with a lantern shielded against the wind. Eli was still inside, sweat plastering his shirt to his back, his face streaked with dirt. Ranger circled him in wary half-moons, snorting, but the wild fury that had once filled the stallion's eyes had dulled into suspicion, tempered with something more fragile. Clara gripped the rail. "You shouldn't be here," Eli muttered, without looking at her. His voice carried the rasp of exhaustion, yet it held no anger. "I wanted to help," she said, her chin tilting with stubborn pride. She slipped the harmonica through the rails. "This belonged to my grandfather. He swore a horse listens better to music than to commands. I think Ranger believes it too." Eli turned, surprise etched across his dirt-streaked face. The harmonica gleamed faintly in the lantern glow, a small thing yet heavy with history. He took it, running his thumb across the metal as though it were something holy. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, after a long silence. Clara hesitated, her breath clouding in the night air. "Because my father plays with power the way boys play with firecrackers. He doesn't care if people burn. And because," she faltered, her voice dropping low, Because I think you're the only one who can save that horse." Ranger tossed his head, stamping the dirt. The boy raised the harmonica to his lips and let out a trembling tune. The notes wavered, cracked, then found their place in the cool dark. The stallion's ears flicked forward, his great body swaying as though caught by the invisible thread of sound. Clara's chest tightened. She had grown up among horses all her life, had seen trainers break them with whips and spurs, with chains and fire. Never had she seen one pause because a boy chose not to fight at all. The next morning she returned with a notebook tucked under her arm. She handed it over without explanation. Inside were sketches of horse anatomy copied from her lessons, scribbled notes about pressure points, gentle methods she had overheard from old ranch hands long dismissed by her father. Eli leafed through the pages, his lips parting in astonishment. "You drew all this?" he asked. Clara shrugged. "I listened. And I remembered together they began to shape a plan." While Charles Whitmore strutted about town boasting that the boy would be crushed before the month was over, Clara and Eli shared whispers by the corral fence. She warned him which ranch hands were loyal to her father, which would sabotage him if ordered. She slipped him apples from the kitchen, ointment for his rope-burned hands, even a book of cowboy ballads that he read aloud to Ranger in the evenings, until the stallion's wild eyes softened into something almost thoughtful. As days lengthened into weeks, the bond between the two children deepened. Clara, who had known only the brittle pride of wealth, began to feel the raw edges of courage. Eli, who had carried loneliness like a weight, began to know what it meant to share the load. And though neither of them said it aloud, each understood that something far greater than a wager had begun to take root between them. But shadows lingered at the edge of their secret. Charles Whitmore had spies among his own household. Men who reported every movement, every kindness his daughter extended to the boy he despised. At night, Clara heard her father's heavy footsteps pacing the length of the porch, his voice rumbling through the walls as he muttered about betrayal, about pride, about land and legacy. She knew the day would come when the secret she guarded would be dragged into the open. For now, though, she stood beside the corral under the vast Texas sky, lantern light dancing in her eyes, and watched as Eli lifted the harmonica again. Ranger lowered his head, the faintest tremor in his chest as though he were listening to more than music. And Clara, her heart pressed tight with both fear and wonder, thought that maybe, just maybe, the boy and the beast were teaching her a new language, one her father would never understand. The 15th morning broke with a sky the color of hammered copper, the air heavy with dust carried on a restless wind. Eli rose before dawn, his body stiff with aches that no boy his age should have carried, but he pushed himself forward with the stubborn rhythm of duty. He had learned that Ranger was a storm disguised in muscle and hide, and storms did not yield overnight. They needed time, patience, and the rare courage to stand in their path until the fury began to tire. That day, Clara joined him openly for the first time. She walked down from the Whitmore house with her braid loose over her shoulder, holding a basket covered in cloth. Inside were biscuits still warm from the oven and a jar of salve she had stolen from the medicine chest. "For your hands," she said, setting it down by the fence. Eli blinked at her, unused to such kindness. But before he could answer, Ranger screamed and slammed his hooves against the corral boards, demanding their full attention. Eli climbed through the gate, and entered the dust. The stallion was restless, pawing at the ground, tossing his head with a violence that sent dirt flying into the air. Eli steadied his breathing, whispering low. He had grown used to the routine. Approach slow, wait, never push. But something about Ranger's movements was different. His stride was uneven, the rhythm broken. Hours passed, and still the horse paced with that same falter. Clara leaned forward, gripping the rails. "He's limping," she whispered, her voice tight. Eli narrowed his eyes, following the line of the horse's movement. Each time Ranger struck the dirt, the right forehoof caught just a fraction too soon, the muscles twitching with hidden pain. Eli's heart clenched. This wasn't just fury or defiance. This was suffering. That evening, when the sun bled red across the horizon, Eli stayed longer than usual. He sat cross-legged in the dust, playing the harmonica while Ranger circled. The tune was soft, almost a lullaby, notes carrying into the cooling air. Slowly, the stallion's strides shortened, his ears flicking forward, his body heaving with the weight of exhaustion. When at last he stilled, Eli noticed the hoof again. The way Ranger shifted his weight to avoid pressure, the flinch that rippled through his chest when he stepped wrong. The next morning, Eli came prepared. He carried not just oats and music, but a determination sharp as flint. Clara watched from the fence as he inched closer than ever before, whispering steady words, the harmonica dangling from a cord around his neck. Ranger flared his nostrils, but he did not strike. Step by step, Eli approached until he was close enough to see the rim of metal embedded deep where the shoe met flesh. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, his hands trembling as he crouched. The smell of sweat and earth filled his lungs. He reached down, his fingers brushing the hoof, and Ranger snorted, jerking back with a jolt of fear. Dust exploded, hooves pounding, but Eli did not run. He stood his ground, arms loose at his sides, waiting until the storm settled again. Hours stretched. Sweat rolled into Eli's eyes, stinging, but he returned again and again to that hoof. At last, with a sound that split the silence, Ranger allowed him to touch it. Eli's fingers found the sharp edge of metal buried cruelly in the frog of the hoof, a shard from a rusted nail or broken shoe left to fester. Pain had been his prison all along. Eli pressed his forehead against the horse's shoulder, whispering, "I see it now. You weren't angry. You were hurting." With Clara's help, he worked slowly, easing the shard free with a borrowed knife, his hands raw and shaking. Ranger trembled, sweat slick on his hide, but he did not strike. He stood as though some part of him understood the boy's intention. When the fragment finally clattered into the dirt, Ranger let out a sound unlike any he had made before. Not rage, not fear, but a long, shuddering sigh. The crowd of ranch hands who had gathered muttered in disbelief. Some crossed themselves, as if they had witnessed something holy. Clara pressed her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with awe. Eli sat back, dust coating every inch of him, his chest heaving. Ranger shifted his weight, testing the freed hoof, then lowered his head until his muzzle brushed the boy's shoulder. For one breathtaking heartbeat, horse and boy stood together in silence, the bond between them sealed not by force, but by compassion. From the porch, Charles Whitmore watched with narrowed eyes, his jaw tight. He saw not miracle, but threat. The wager he had cast like a cruel joke was turning against him. The boy was not breaking, he was winning. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, Eli walked home with blistered hands and a heart that burned brighter than the lantern he carried. He had not tamed Ranger. Not yet. But he had uncovered the truth of the beast, and in doing so, uncovered something in himself. The belief that healing, not dominance, was the path forward. And in the quiet darkness, with his grandmother asleep in her chair and Clara's secret gifts tucked away by the bed, Eli whispered a promise to the night. 30 days won't be long enough to break you, Ranger. But maybe it's long enough to set us both free. The 20th day dawned under a sky swollen with gray clouds, the air thick as if holding its breath. Eli woke before sunrise, his body sore from endless hours in the corral, his hands blistered from rope and shovel. Yet beneath the ache burned a quiet flame. He had pulled the shard from Ranger's hoof, and since that moment the stallion's eyes had changed. The rage was still there, but now it lived alongside something else. Recognition. That morning, Ranger allowed Eli to stroke his neck for longer than a heartbeat, his skin twitching but no longer shying away. Clara leaned against the rail, her braid undone, her notebook clutched to her chest. "He trusts you," she whispered. Eli only shook his head, though a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Trust was too big a word, but it was coming. By evening, word of the boy's progress had spread beyond Amarillo. Families rode out to the ranch just to watch him work with the black stallion. Men muttered that maybe Charles Whitmore had met his match. And Charles, though he kept his bourbon steady in his hand, felt the unease gnawing at him like rats in the walls of a house. That night, when the lanterns had been doused and the crowd had gone home, the ranch yard fell silent except for the sighing of cattle in distant pens. Eli lingered longer than usual, brushing Ranger's coat under the pale wash of moonlight. He hummed a tune on the harmonica Clara had given him, soft enough that it seemed to come from the stars themselves. The stallion's ears twitched, his head lowering, his breathing slowing. It was then the first firecracker screamed into the night. Ranger exploded, muscles snapping tight, hooves lashing against the boards with a sound like cannon fire. Eli dropped the brush, his chest lurching. Another crack split the silence, red sparks fanning across the sky. Panic ripped through the stallion, his eyes rolling white, his body crashing against the rails until wood groaned under the assault. "Whoa, easy!" Eli cried, pressing his palms forward. But Ranger was lost to fear, the smell of smoke and powder dragging him back to pain too deep for words. From the shadows beyond the fence, laughter carried, low, cruel, unmistakable. Eli whirled and caught sight of two of Whitmore's hired hands retreating into the dark, one clutching the spent tube of a firework, the other slapping his thigh in glee. Their boots scraped the gravel as they disappeared into the night. "Bastards!" Clara hissed from the rail, her face pale in the moonlight. "They're trying to undo everything." Eli's heart pounded. He turned back just as Ranger reared, the stallion's hooves striking the air so close the wind of them brushed his cheek. For a moment Eli thought the horse would crush him, send him sprawling into the dirt. But he stood his ground, voice trembling but steady. "Listen to me, Ranger. It's over. No one's going to hurt you tonight. I'm here." The stallion landed hard, sweat lathering his neck, sides heaving like bellows. But the words, soft, desperate, threaded through the chaos. Slowly, impossibly, the wild tremor in his body eased. He stamped once, twice, then froze, his head swinging toward Eli as though searching for proof in the boy's eyes. Eli raised the harmonica to his lips. His hands shook, but the notes came. Thin at first, then stronger, carrying across the pen. Ranger's ears flicked, his breathing hitching, until at last he lowered his head and exhaled a long, shuddering breath. Clara's fingers gripped the rail so tightly her knuckles whitened. "He calmed him," she whispered. "After all that, he calmed him." The corral fell into silence again, broken only by the boy's uneven song and the heavy rhythm of the stallion's breathing. Eli lowered the harmonica, every nerve alight with exhaustion and relief. He crossed the dirt slowly, laid his palm against Ranger's muzzle, and felt the tremor in the great animal's body. "We'll make it," he whispered, his cheek brushing the stallion's mane. "Even if the world's against us." But as he glanced toward the shadows where the hired men had disappeared, he knew the battle was no longer just against time or the beast's mistrust. Charles Whitmore had begun to fear him, and fear bred cruelty. The firecrackers were only the first strike. Worse would come. Eli left the corral near midnight, the moon high, Clara walking beside him in silence. The town slept under the blanket of dust and stars, unaware of the war being waged in the dark. He carried the scent of smoke in his hair and the echo of Ranger's panic in his chest. And as the wind whispered across the panhandle, rattling dry mesquite pods like bones, Eli understood that this was no longer about a wager or even about a horse. It was about survival, his grandmother's, and the black stallion whose trust had become the one fragile light in the long, dangerous night. The 25th day brought with it a sky of hard blue and a wind that carried grit sharp enough to sting the skin. Eli stood at the corral, his shoulders stiff from another night of poor sleep. The firecracker ambush still haunted Ranger. Sometimes the stallion woke with a scream, battering the rails until Eli's voice or the tremble of the harmonica pulled him back from panic. The boy had new bruises from near misses, but he carried them like badges. What frightened him more was the shadow in Whitmore's eyes whenever their paths crossed. It was no longer the look of a man confident in his own wager. It was the look of someone calculating what might happen if he lost. That morning, Sheriff Coleman came to the ranch. He leaned against the rail while Eli worked with Ranger, his hat brim low, his eyes thoughtful. "Boy," he said finally, "there's something you ought to know. A story about that horse, one your opponent don't want told." Eli brushed the sweat-slick hide, pausing only when Ranger shivered under his touch. "What story?" The sheriff's voice dropped, a gravelly murmur meant for Eli's ears alone. "Your father once owned a stallion. Black, strong, wild. Folks said he was the pride of his herd. When your daddy died, the debts came due quick. Whitmore bought the horse for pennies, waved the paper in town like he'd rescued the beast from ruin. But those who knew better, like me, called it what it was, theft by another name." Eli froze, his hand pressed against Ranger's neck. The stallion turned his great head as if sensing the storm that rolled through the boy's chest. "You mean?" His voice cracked. "Ranger belonged to my father?" Coleman nodded. "I've got the bill of sale tucked in the courthouse files. I never thought it would matter again. But now? Now it might be the key to more than just this wager. It might be the truth that tips the whole county against Charles Whitmore. Clara had been listening from the far side of the fence, her face pale. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes darting toward the ranch house where her father's shadow loomed across every wall. "If he learns you know," she whispered, "he'll come after you harder than before." Eli's throat ached. Memories of his father rose in fragments, calloused hands setting him in the saddle, the smell of leather and sweat, a low voice whispering, "Trust a horse first, son, if you want him to trust you back." Now the pieces fit together. The familiarity in Ranger's eyes, the strange pull he had felt from the start. This wasn't fate alone. This was blood and legacy. That evening, the boy walked Ranger around the corral as the sun bled into the horizon. The stallion's limp was nearly gone, his steps stronger, his breath steadier. Eli hummed the tune of the harmonica, though the instrument stayed in his pocket. The song was enough. When Ranger lowered his head to nuzzle the boy's shoulder, Eli felt the bond deepen into something unshakable. But danger moved closer with every step of progress. Later that night, Margaret Whitmore slipped from the porch to find Clara and Eli whispering by the fence. Her face, etched with years of silence under her husband's rule, carried both fear and resolve. "The sheriff is right," she said quietly. "I saw the papers myself when your father brought Ranger home." He was proud, Eli. Proud in a way I never saw him before. Charles stole that pride from you. And now he aims to steal your future, too. You need to be ready. Men like him don't lose gracefully. Eli's chest tightened, torn between grief and fury. Clara reached through the rail to grasp his hand, her fingers warm against his dirt-streaked skin. "Then we'll fight with more than courage," she said. "We'll fight with the truth." Above them, the night stretched vast and merciless, stars scattered like sparks from a fire that refused to die. Eli looked into Ranger's dark eyes, seeing not just the wildness, but the inheritance his father had left behind. This was no longer about a boy proving himself, or a horse learning trust. It was about reclaiming something stolen: dignity, family, justice. As the wind shifted, carrying the smell of mesquite smoke and the distant cry of coyotes, Eli pressed his forehead to Ranger's. "They'll come for us," he whispered. "But they don't know we were won long before this wager began." The stallion snorted, breath hot against the boy's face, and for a moment it felt like an oath shared between them, an oath that no force of money, cruelty, or fear could ever erase. The 27th day found the Panhandle skies swollen with the weight of a coming storm. Clouds stretched low and dark, as if they carried the temper of the man who owned half the land beneath them. Charles Whitmore stood on his wide porch, a glass of bourbon in his hand, staring across his empire with eyes that no longer gleamed with pride, but with a gnawing, restless fury. From the fairgrounds to the saloons, people were whispering about the boy and the stallion. Every story made Eli bigger and Charles smaller, every rumor another stone on the scale tipping against him. Inside the house, Margaret moved quietly, her presence soft but unyielding. She no longer tried to temper his rage with reason. She had learned that silence was the safer companion to his pride. But Clara, head held high, had stopped lowering her gaze. Charles caught her once slipping a book from the shelf to the porch where Eli often sat late at night. He said nothing then, but the ice in his eyes had chilled her more than any shout. That evening, after supper, Charles gathered his most loyal hands around the long oak table in the bunkhouse. The air reeked of tobacco and sweat, of fear masked by laughter. Cole Brandt, wiry and hard-eyed, leaned forward with a smirk. "Boss, the boy's got nerve, but nerve won't last when that black devil throws him. 30 days ain't enough to gentle a beast like Ranger." Charles slammed his fist on the table. the glasses rattling. "It's already too much. That boy's turned a sideshow into a sermon. Every time he sets foot in that corral, the people cheer louder. They're forgetting who owns this land, who sets the rules. They see him as hope. I'll not be made a fool in my own county." The men muttered their agreement, though unease flickered behind their eyes. Everyone had seen Eli with Ranger, had felt the hush that fell when the stallion allowed the boy to touch him. It had been no trick. It had been something raw and undeniable, and even hardened ranch hands found themselves unsettled by it. Charles leaned back, his gaze sharp as a blade. "If I lose, I don't just lose land. I lose face. And a man without his face is already buried. That boy will not win. Not if I have to stack the odds myself." Cole shifted in his chair. "What are you saying, sir?" "I'm saying," Charles growled, "accidents happen. A stallion can kill a man without meaning to. A boy? Easier still. But if he fails before the final day, if he quits or bleeds or breaks, then no one will question me. They'll call it fate, not failure." The room went still. Margaret, listening unseen from the doorway, felt her stomach turn. She pressed a hand against her mouth to stifle the cry that threatened to rise. Clara, upstairs, felt the vibration of her father's voice in the floorboards and clutched her pillow until her nails tore the fabric. Later, when the meeting ended and the men spilled out into the dark with their cigarettes glowing like fireflies, Charles lingered. He poured another drink, his hand steady though his reflection in the glass trembled. Pride was the only law he recognized, and pride demanded blood when threatened. The storm broke that night with a violence that shook the windows, rain lashing the plains like a scourge. Eli sat awake in his cabin, listening to the thunder roll, every crash echoing the pounding of Ranger's hooves in his mind. His grandmother dozed in her chair, the rattle in her chest rising with each breath. He pulled a blanket around her shoulders and whispered, "Hold on, Grandma." Just a few more days. Across the fields, lightning forked above Whitmore's ranch, illuminating the corral where Ranger stood, braced against the gale. For a heartbeat, Eli thought he saw the stallion's silhouette framed against the flash. Unbroken. Unbowed, a creature carved from storm itself. And he knew then that Charles was right about one thing. No man alive could force this horse into submission. Trust was the only bridge, and Eli was the only one who'd dared to build it. But he also knew the danger had shifted. It wasn't just about surviving the saddle anymore. It was about surviving the wrath of a man who would rather see both boy and horse broken than witness his own pride undone. As the rain hammered down, Eli pressed his forehead against the window pane, watching the dark horizon. The storm outside would pass. The one inside Charles Whitmore had only just begun. The storm left the land sodden and bruised, the panhandle sky washed pale as bone. Water pooled in the wagon ruts, and the air smelled of wet mesquite, and earth turned soft beneath the hooves of cattle. Eli rose with the dawn, every muscle stiff, his hands bandaged from rope burns, but his spirit braced for another day. There were only 5 mornings left before the wager reached its end, 5 chances to prove that trust could grow strong enough to carry the weight of a boy and a horse against the pride of a man like Charles Whitmore. Ranger stood, restless in the corral, mud splattering as he pawed the ground, steam rising from his nostrils. He was wild still, unpredictable, but the rage that had once filled his eyes had dimmed into something else. a question that hovered between them each time Eli approached. Clara appeared at the fence with her braid damp from rain, her boots caked in clay. She carried a lantern, though the sun had risen, as if determined to bring her own light into the boys' fight. "Another long day," she said softly. Eli only nodded. Words seemed fragile in the heavy morning air. He stepped through the gate with his bucket of oats, set it down, and began to hum. The harmonica lay in his pocket, but sometimes his voice alone was enough. Ranger's ears twitched, his head lowering as he listened. Eli reached out slowly, brushing mud from the stallion's flank, his hand steady despite the tremor in his arm. For a long time they stayed like that, the boy's breath sinking with the horses, silence filling the space where fear once lived. Then Eli did something he had not dared before. He pressed his forehead against Ranger's neck. The stallion stiffened, muscles coiled as though ready to strike, but then he let out a long, shuddering sigh. Clara gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "He's letting you in," she whispered. Over the next days, Eli pushed the bond further. He brushed Ranger's mane until the black hair shone like polished coal. He walked him in slow circles, coaxing him to follow with nothing but a rope draped loosely over his neck. He leaned his weight against the stallion's side, whispering, "One day soon, you'll carry me. Not because you're forced to, but because you choose to." On the 28th day, as dusk burned orange across the horizon, Eli brought a blanket into the corral. Clara's eyes widened. You can't already." "I have to try," Eli said simply. His voice was calm, though his heart hammered like a drum. He draped the blanket across Ranger's back. The stallion flinched, snorted, stepped sideways. Eli let the cloth fall, stooped to pick it up, and began again. Each time Ranger shied, Eli returned with patience, his voice steady, his touch gentle. By the 5th attempt, the blanket stayed. The stallion stood trembling but did not bolt. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "He trusts you more than anyone." That night, Eli sat on the porch with his grandmother, the harmonica pressed to his lips. Martha Turner's cough rattled in the quiet, but her eyes were brighter than they had been in weeks. She listened to the boy's uneven tune and whispered, "Your father would be proud." He believed in kindness over cruelty, always said a horse will give you his heart if you give him yours first. Eli's throat tightened. "I wish he could see this." "Maybe he can," Martha said, her gaze drifting toward the stars. "Maybe he never left at all." The 29th day dawned with clear skies, the air sharp and bright. Eli entered the corral with the blanket again, and this time Ranger barely flinched. He pressed his cheek to the stallion's shoulder, whispering, "Tomorrow, we'll face them all. But tonight, it's just you and me." As the sun bled into the horizon, Eli climbed halfway onto Ranger's back, his heart in his throat. For a moment, the stallion quivered. Every muscle coiled. But instead of bucking, Ranger stood still. Eli slid back down, patting his neck with trembling hands. He didn't push further. Trust was fragile, and he would not risk breaking it the night before their greatest test. That evening, thunder rolled far away on the horizon, though no storm followed. Eli lay awake on the porch beside his grandmother's chair, staring at the stars. He thought of his father's voice, the sheriff's warning, Clara's secret sketches, Margaret's whispered truth. All of it led to this. The final day, when the boy with nothing but a harmonica and a wounded horse would face a town's gaze, a man's pride, and the weight of his own hope. He reached into his pocket, fingers tracing the worn metal of the harmonica. In the distance, Ranger neighed, the sound carrying across the dark like a call to arms. Eli closed his eyes and whispered, "Tomorrow, we show them who we are." The morning of the 30th day arrived with a sky so wide and unbroken it seemed painted just for spectacle. Dust rose from the road as wagons and trucks rattled toward the Amarillo fairgrounds, each carrying families dressed in their best Sunday shirts, though it was only Saturday. The air smelled of roasting meat, kettle corn, and horse sweat. Vendors hammered their signs into the ground, children clutched balloons, and the murmur of anticipation grew into a roar as the hour of reckoning drew near. Eli walked the mile with Ranger at his side, the stallion's black coat gleaming under the sun. He had brushed every inch of him until the animal shone like liquid obsidian, though the boy's own shirt clung with dust and sweat. Clara walked on the other side, her chin high despite the shadow of her father's gaze. Behind them, Sheriff Coleman rode slowly, a steady presence that lent weight to every step. Folks along the roadside fell silent as they passed, hats tipping, whispers rising. "That's the boy. That's the horse. They're really going to try." The fairground had been transformed into an arena. Bleachers rose around the main corral, every seat packed tight. A brass band played rowdy tunes, though the music faltered each time someone glanced at the black stallion snorting in the dust. Charles Whitmore stood on a raised platform, dressed in a pressed white shirt and polished boots, a cigar glowing at his lips. His smile was wide but strained, the kind of grin that hides fear beneath its teeth. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer bellowed into a crackling microphone, "welcome to the Whitmore Challenge. 30 days ago, a boy dared to do the impossible. Today, we see if he can ride the untamable Ranger." The crowd erupted, part cheers, part jeers. Bets had been scrawled on chalkboards at saloons across town. Some said Eli wouldn't last 3 seconds. Others claimed he'd surprise them all. But no one could deny the pull of the moment. Pride, money, legend, it all hung in the hot Texas air. Eli stood at the gate, heart pounding so hard he thought the world might hear it. Clara touched his arm, whispering, "Remember what you told him. Not because he's forced to, but because he chooses to." Her eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. Sheriff Coleman raised his hand, silencing the restless crowd. "We all know the terms." 30 days have passed. Today, the boy rides. 1 minute in the saddle proves the wager true. His gaze flicked toward Charles, a warning in his eyes. "No tricks, no interference. The law's watching." The gate creaked open. Ranger pawed the earth, his breath streaming like smoke. Eli stepped forward, brushing the stallion's mane, murmuring low so only the horse could hear. "It's just you and me, Ranger. We've come too far to turn back." Slowly, with a patience honed by weeks of bruises and faith, he swung a leg over the horse's back. The crowd gasped. Ranger shifted, muscles quivering, ears flicking. For a moment it seemed he might erupt into fury. But Eli pressed his hands lightly on his neck, his voice steady, humming the tune he had played so many nights. The stallion stilled, sides heaving. "Time starts now," the announcer cried. Ranger surged forward, the sudden force hurling dust into the air. The bleachers rattled with shouts as the stallion broke into a gallop, circling the arena. Eli clung low, not with fists or spurs but with balance, his body moving in rhythm with the horses. When Ranger veered, Eli leaned. When he slowed, Eli breathed with him. 30 days of trust carried them in a dance that looked less like domination and more like freedom given form. Half a minute passed. The crowd, stunned, grew louder with each second. Mothers covered their mouths, children screamed with delight, old ranch hands shook their heads in disbelief. At 40 seconds, a crack of thunder rolled across the plains, though the sky held no storm. Ranger flinched, muscles taut, but Eli's voice cut through, soft and sure. "It's just thunder, buddy. We're stronger than fear." The stallion steadied, his strides lengthening. 50 seconds. Charles's cigar snapped in half between his teeth. He shouted something, but his words were lost in the roar. Margaret stood at the edge of the platform, her face pale, her eyes wet with a truth she had long buried. At 60 seconds, Sheriff Coleman raised his hand high. "Time!" The arena exploded. Hats flew into the air. Voices thundered. Ranger slowed, dust swirling like smoke around him, and Eli sat tall in the saddle, his chest rising with the force of triumph. For a breathless moment, the world seemed to stop. The boy and the beast framed against the wide Texas sky as if etched into legend. Clara's hands trembled against the rail, her heart leaping with pride. Margaret closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of thanks. And Charles Whitmore, his face crimson, his pride bleeding in front of all Amarillo, stood frozen on the platform, a man who had just watched everything he thought unbreakable crumble to dust. Eli slid from Ranger's back, his knees weak, but his smile fierce. He pressed his forehead against the stallion's, whispering, "We did it." And Ranger, untamable no more, let out a low, rolling nicker, a sound that carried like victory across the fairground. The wager was won. But the true storm, the reckoning of pride, justice, and the weight of truth, was still to come. The fairground was still trembling from the roar of voices when Ranger, sweat shining on his black coat, tossed his head as if the minute in the saddle had only woken something deeper. Eli slid a hand along his neck, steadying him, feeling the powerful heart thrum beneath the hide. The announcer's voice cracked with excitement as he shouted for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just witnessed history. The untamable Ranger has carried a rider for 60 full seconds." But the crowd would not be stilled. They surged to their feet, hats flung in the air, boots stomping on wood bleachers until the whole arena shook. Mothers who had shielded their children now lifted them high to see. Cowboys with hands scarred from their own failures cheered as though the boy's victory belonged to them too. For once, Amarillo had turned into a cathedral of awe, its hymn the thunder of applause. Eli sat tall in the saddle, one hand resting lightly on the stallion's mane, his face streaked with dust and sweat, his eyes alight with something greater than pride. It was not conquest, but communion. Ranger did not buck, did not rear. He moved as though he had chosen the boy, as though horse and rider had always been meant to meet in this moment. At the platform, Charles Whitmore's face hardened into something fierce and unrecognizable. He spat the remnants of his broken cigar into the dirt. "It's not finished," he barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "1 minute proves nothing. Let him ride longer. Let him prove it wasn't luck." Gasps rippled through the bleachers. The sheriff stepped forward, his hand raised for order. "The terms were clear, Charles. 30 days, 1 minute in the saddle. The boy has won fair and square. But Charles was beyond reason. 'This is my land, my horse. He's nothing but a thief's whelp and a trickster.' His voice rose, ragged with fury. 'Ride him again, boy, or admit you're a coward.' The crowd shifted uneasily, tension crackling like dry grass before a fire. Margaret stepped from the platform, her face white, but resolute. 'Charles, enough,' she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. 'The whole county heard your promise. To deny it now is to deny your own name.' Her husband's eyes flashed, his pride wounded deeper than any blade could cut. But Eli, still astride the stallion, leaned forward and whispered in Ranger's ear. Then, with a soft pressure of his legs, he guided the horse into a gallop. The crowd gasped as Ranger surged forward, hooves pounding the dirt like drums of war. Dust rose in golden clouds around them. Eli bent low, moving in rhythm with the stallion's stride, his hair whipping in the wind. They cut across the arena, wheeled sharp, then leapt forward again with a grace no one had expected. The black horse flew as if every chain of fear had shattered, carrying the boy not as burden, but as chosen companion. Children screamed with delight, women clutched each other, men hollered until their throats ached. For 60 more seconds, then 90, then 2 full minutes, Ranger bore Eli across the corral as though the two had been forged from the same flame. The fairground had never seen such a sight. The devil horse turned legend, the orphan boy turned hero. When at last Eli slowed Ranger to a trot and drew him to the center, silence fell as sudden as a snapped rope. Dust swirled in the fading sunlight, wrapping them in a halo. Eli swung down, legs trembling, and pressed his forehead to Ranger's muzzle. The stallion blew a hot breath against him, calm, steady, unbroken. Sheriff Coleman's voice carried into the hush. "There can be no doubt. The boy has not only met the wager, he's surpassed it." The crowd erupted once more, louder than before, a tide of voices that rolled across the plains. Yet in the midst of the triumph, eyes turned toward Charles Whitmore. His lips were pressed thin, his fists clenched at his sides. He had been cornered before his people, stripped of the armor of pride. Clara hurried from the rail, her boots striking the dust as she reached Eli. For a moment, she forgot the crowd, the danger, the weight of her father's rage. She threw her arms around the boy, her voice trembling. "You did it. You really did it." Eli smiled, though his eyes searched the platform where Charles stood. He knew the battle wasn't done. Victory had been earned, but acceptance was another war. Still, as the sun dipped and the shadows stretched across Amarillo, Eli Turner and Ranger stood as one. Against every doubt, against every cruelty, they had proved the impossible. And though Charles's fury brewed like a storm on the horizon, the people had already chosen their legend. The dust of triumph had barely settled when Charles Whitmore's voice split the air like a whip. He stood at the platform, his face red, his chest heaving, his pride bleeding in front of all Amarillo. "This wager was never serious," he shouted, his words slashing through the cheers. "It was a joke, a spectacle for fools. No ranch, no land, No promise ever belonged to this boy. Dersun. Crowd froze, their roar collapsing into stunned murmurs. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his hand resting on the badge pinned to his vest. That's not what you said 30 days ago, Charles. Every man, woman, and child here heard your word. And in this county, a man's word is his bond. But Charles only sneered, his voice louder, harsher. My word means nothing when twisted by liars and beggars. That horse was never his to claim, and I'll be damned before I hand over 1 acre to some orphan boy who got lucky with a trick. Gasps rippled through the bleachers. Mothers held their children close. Men glanced at one another with unease. They had seen the boy ride, seen the horse surrender his fury to a whisper. It was no trick. Still, Charles's voice carried the weight of power, the kind that had bent the county to his will for decades. Eli stood by Ranger's side, his hands tight against the stallion's neck. The boy's chest rose and fell, his heart hammering, but his eyes never left the man who had just tried to erase his victory. You promised, he said quietly, but his voice carried across the silent arena. You promised in front of everyone. Charles laughed, sharp and bitter. And you believed me? A child who doesn't know the world, thinking words bind men like me. Fool Margaret stepped down from the platform then, her face pale but resolute. She raised her voice above the murmurs. Enough, Charles. The boy won. You know it, and so does everyone here. To deny it now is to tear down your own name. Her husband turned on her, fury flaring in his eyes. You dare stand against me? I dare, Margaret answered, her chin lifting, because the truth has stood too long in your shadow. And I will not watch you drag this family into disgrace. Clara rushed forward, her braid falling loose, her cheeks flushed with defiance. He's right, Father. You can't take this from Eli. He earned it, and you know it. Ranger chose him. The crowd stirred, whispers rising like wind over prairie grass. The sheriff raised a hand. Charles, listen well. Deny your word today, and you won't just lose your land. You'll lose every ounce of respect left to your name. These people won't follow a man whose promises rot in his mouth. But Charles's pride was a beast larger than any stallion. He slammed his fist against the railing. Respect? Respect is taken, not given. Let the boy try to claim what he thinks he's won. He'll learn the world isn't built for his kind, and if anyone here dares to stand with him, they'll find themselves my enemy. The fairground erupted in chaos. Some shouted their support for Eli, others muttered fearfully about crossing Whitmore. The air thickened with tension, the smell of sweat and dust mingling with the bitterness of betrayal. Ranger reared once, sensing the storm around him, and Eli held fast, whispering into his ear until the stallion settled. Margaret climbed down into the arena, her skirts brushing the dirt. She took Eli's hand, her grip trembling but firm. You're not alone, child, she said. Not anymore. Clara joined her, slipping her arm through Eli's, her face fierce with loyalty. The sheriff stepped beside them, his hand resting on his revolver but his eyes steady. The law saw what happened here. No power of pride can erase it. For the first time, Charles stood isolated, his power cracking like old timber. The people who had once bent beneath his will now wavered, torn between fear and the undeniable truth they had just witnessed. Eli lifted his chin, his voice steady despite the fire in his chest. I didn't come here for revenge. I came because my grandmother deserves a home, and because Ranger deserves freedom. If you won't keep your word, then the world will remember you as a liar, not a man." The words cut deeper than any blade. The crowd roared again, not with laughter this time, but with anger and defiance. And in that roar, Charles Whitmore's grip on his kingdom began to fracture. But as Eli stood in the dust, the warmth of Ranger at his back, and the support of those beside him, he knew this battle was far from finished. Pride does not die quietly. It claws, it bites, and it takes as many down with it as it can. And Charles Whitmore was not yet done clawing. The fairground emptied slowly, voices still buzzing like a hive long after the queen has fled. Lanterns swung on their poles, casting thin beams of light across the churned dirt of the arena. Ranger stood calm now, his black hide gleaming with sweat, the fury of the day behind him, but not forgotten. Eli rested one hand on the stallion's neck, drawing strength from the steady rhythm of his breathing. All around him, people lingered in small clusters, whispering about Whitmore's betrayal, about the boy's courage, about what it all might mean for Amarillo. Charles had stormed from the platform hours earlier, his cigar crushed under his boot, his pride in tatters. Margaret walked in the opposite direction, her shoulders straight, though her eyes shimmered with years of silence breaking at last. Clara remained at Eli's side, her hand brushing his in quiet solidarity. For the first time, Whitmore's empire looked fractured, cracks spreading from the very heart of the family. Sheriff Coleman approached through the dispersing crowd, his boots heavy against the boards. He tipped his hat to Eli, his voice calm but firm. "You've won the wager, son, and the whole county knows it. But land and titles don't heal wounds. What do you mean to do now?" Eli hesitated. The question echoed inside him louder than the applause had. He thought of his grandmother sitting on the porch, rocking in her chair with the quilt over her knees, her lungs rattling with each breath. He thought of the hunger in his own belly, the thin walls of their cabin, the fear of losing everything. And then he thought of Ranger, once broken by pain, now standing free because someone had listened instead of forced. "I don't want it all," Eli said finally, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "I never did. A boy like me doesn't need to own a kingdom. I only need a piece of earth for my grandmother to rest, and enough room for this horse to run without chains." The sheriff's brow lifted. "That's your choice? After all this, after proving yourself before every soul in Amarillo, you'd settle for half?" Eli nodded, his eyes steady. "Half is enough. More than enough. And with it, I'll build something that lasts longer than pride, a place for children like me, who grew up with nothing but empty hands, a place for horses like Ranger, who were thrown away because no one saw their worth, not a ranch for power, but a home for healing." The words rippled through the fairground, turning whispers into gasps, gasps into applause. People began to cheer again, this time not for spectacle, but for vision. Clara's eyes glistened as she gripped his hand tighter. Margaret stepped closer, her voice breaking but strong. "Then let me stand with you, Eli. Let me give back what pride has stolen. If Charles cannot honor his promise, I will." The sheriff raised his hand for quiet. "You've all heard it. The boy has chosen mercy where another might choose vengeance. He asks not for domination, but for justice and hope. And I, for one, will see it honored." The crowd roared, a tide of voices rolling over the dust. Men pounded their hats against their thighs, women wept openly, and children shouted Eli's name as though it belonged in storybooks already. Ranger tossed his head and let out a wild, ringing cry, as if claiming the moment for himself. Eli pressed his forehead against the stallion's muzzle, whispering, "We don't need to conquer, old friend. We only need to endure Ranger's warm breath washed over his face, sealing the vow." From the porch of the Whitmore house, Charles watched, his shadow stretching long against the lantern light. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched, but his eyes betrayed something new. Fear not of losing land, but of losing the hold he had kept over people for decades. The boy had taken that from him, and no deed or boundary line could restore it. Eli stood tall in the dust, Clara at his side, Margaret's hand resting lightly on his shoulder. In that moment, he knew he had chosen the harder path. Vengeance would have been simpler, but mercy would outlast it. The legend of Amarillo would not be about the pride of a landowner or the cruelty of a bet. It would be about a boy who refused to break, a stallion who refused to bow, and the choice to build something new out of the ruins of betrayal. The crowd surged again, chanting his name, their voices rising into the vast Texas night. And Eli, though weary and bruised, felt lighter than he ever had before. He had not just won a wager, he had won the right to decide what kind of man he would become. The fairground slowly emptied under a canopy of stars, the echoes of voices drifting away, until only the smell of dust and sweat lingered. Lanterns burned low along the rails, their glow softening the jagged edges of the day. Eli stood in the center of the arena with Ranger at his side, the stallion's hide still damp, his breath heavy but calm. Around them, the dirt bore the marks of hooves and footsteps, the story written into the earth itself. The wager was done. The boy had won. Yet the weight of what came next pressed heavier than the saddle he had not dared to place until today. The sheriff clapped a hand on Eli's shoulder, his voice carrying in the quiet. "You've done something no one thought possible. You've got more than victory. You've got the town behind you. Don't waste it, son." His eyes lingered with a mix of pride and warning before he tipped his hat and walked into the night. Clara remained close, her face lit by the lantern glow, her eyes bright with something between relief and wonder. "You changed him," she whispered, glancing at Ranger. "And maybe you changed all of us." Eli met her gaze, uncertain of what to say. Words felt too small for the tide that had turned in just 30 days. Margaret stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her, her voice low but steady. "I will see the land divided, Eli. Half of Whitmore's empire belongs to you now. It will not come without struggle, but I will fight for it. And when history remembers this night, it will not remember Charles's rage, it will remember you." The boy lowered his eyes, shaking his head. "I don't need it all. Just enough for my grandmother to live in peace, and enough for Ranger to run free. The rest, let it serve others who have less than I did." Margaret's lips trembled into the first true smile he had ever seen on her face. Clara reached for his hand, and for a fleeting moment, the boy who had walked barefoot roads with hunger in his belly felt what it meant to be chosen, not pitied. Weeks passed, and the cabin at the Turner farm transformed. Word spread across the county, then beyond, of a boy who tamed the untamable with patience instead of chains. Families brought children to him, boys and girls who had known only cruelty, hoping he might teach them courage. Stray horses arrived, some starved, some broken, all given another chance in the fields where Ranger roamed. The place grew not into a ranch of pride, but into a sanctuary of hope. By the following spring, a sign hung over the gate, hand-painted and plain. The Turner Haven. Beneath it, children laughed as they brushed ponies, and weary animals lifted their heads as though the world had given them back their dignity. Martha Turner, frail but smiling, rocked on the porch, her eyes brighter than her lungs were strong. "Your father would be proud," she told Eli one evening, "not because you won a wager. Because you turned dust into a future." Ranger galloped across the pasture then, mane flying, his body whole again. He slowed only when Eli whistled, trotting to his side, lowering his great head until his muzzle pressed against the boy's chest. Eli stroked his neck, whispering words no one else could hear. The stallion's dark eyes gleamed, not with the fury of a beast, but with the quiet fire of a companion. In town, people still whispered about that day at the Amarillo Fair, about the moment a boy defied a landowner and a wild horse bent his fury into trust. Some said it was a miracle. Others called it fate. But in the years that followed, when children told stories by lantern light and riders spoke around campfires, they did not speak of Whitmore's betrayal. They spoke of Eli Turner, the boy who listened when no one else would. Time carried the tale farther than the plains. Travelers passing through Amarillo came searching for the boy and the stallion. They left speaking of a legend, of a bond born not of force, but of compassion. And long after the dust of that first wager settled, the name Eli Turner became less about a boy and more about a promise. That kindness could tame storms, that patience could heal wounds, and that even in the harshest land, hope could take root. On the last evening of that summer, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon with gold, Eli stood at the pasture's edge. Ranger grazed nearby, peaceful in the twilight. Clara walked up beside him, her braid loose, her voice soft. "Do you ever think about what it cost you?" Eli looked out at the land, the home rebuilt, the children laughing, the horse who had once been a fury now standing calm. "Every day," he admitted. Then he smiled faintly. "And I'd pay it all again." The wind carried the sound of Ranger's whinny across the field, strong and free, echoing into the wide Texas sky. And in that moment, boy and horse stood together, not as master and beast, but as survivors who had carved a legacy from dust, a legacy the world would never forget. And that's how a poor boy and a broken stallion rewrote the pride of an entire town. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple comment. Just type 0 or 1, so I'll know you're here with me. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next stories will take you even deeper into the bond between people and animals, stories that may bring tears, but also hope.